There we go. Well, we welcome you to the North American Climate Justice Team's February webinar. Our North American way of life, built and based on creation, climate, economic, and racial injustice, is unsustainable. Yet the paths to justice, to sustainability, is not always readily visible. And so we invite you to these webinars so that together we might study, share, pray, and discern those paths. So a few housekeeping issues before we dive in. First, if you have comments or questions during the webinar, please put them into the chat and we'll try to get to them at the appropriate time. Also, I want to remind you that our next webinar will be March 26th, titled Climate Impacts on Global Security. Now I will hand it over to Lori.
So let me add my welcome to everyone. Today's very much anticipated guest, Dr. Wallace, who Brad's going to introduce here in a few moments, has written this. The environmental crisis that we now face, at its core, is less a scientific or technological problem and more a spiritual problem. This crisis is a matter of the heart, not the head. So honoring this intuition that we must bring our love for the earth, for God enfleshed in creation, as it were, to the task of shaping a way forward in these portentous times of accelerating climate crisis, I invite us into our hearts with a few moments of contemplative silence today. So, you know the drill. Set aside your busyness and distractions, anything that wants to draw your attention away from just being here together today. Tend the yearning for beauty, for the earth, for the holy that brought you here. Let the core of your being connect with the earthy wisdom embedded in our sacred texts, in our tradition, and in the values that we espouse as a community of faith. So just for the next 5 minutes, may your heart take flight in widening expanses of Spirit's beckoning presence as we tune our hearts to seek a greener path forward. My chime is not working with Zoom, so in your imaginary mind, I'm just going to ask you to take a breath as that signal to enter this contemplative space. So again, inviting you to your breath as we release our gazing and prepare to move into our time of listening and learning. Just a few closing remarks. Our understanding of each of the enduring principles is enriched when they're read through the lens of any one of the others. Every one of them interacts and enlivens each other. So in the face of collapsing ecosystems and the mounting climate crisis, we began with sacredness of creation. And we're asking ourselves, how might the enduring principles guide my response to the destruction of this achingly beautiful world that is suffused with divine presence? And then let us ask together, how might the foundational values of our faith traditions, all of our faith traditions gathered here, call us to collective action to care for and protect that sacred creation so that all life might flourish? All of us are called.
Thank you, Lori, for that contemplative pause and centering for us going into our presentation today. So many years ago, I met Mark at a conference on religion and ecology, and somehow I convinced him to be a participant in my doctoral work. And so it is a privilege and a joy to be able to introduce him today. So Mark is the James Hormel Professor of Social Justice in the Department of Religion at Swarthmore College. At Swarthmore, he directs what's called the Chester Semester. It's a fellowship with college students and the Chester, Pennsylvania city, and partners. They do these internships about education and environmental justice. He's also been a visiting professor at a number of universities, the University of Pennsylvania, Princeton Theological Seminary, the Japanese International Christian University. And he is also a core faculty, a member of the US State Department's Institute on Religious Pluralism at Temple University. Mark has a large body of work, both articles and books. His recent book, When God Was a Bird, Christianity, Animism, and the Re-enchantment of the World, was awarded the 2019 Nautilus Gold Award for the best book in Western religious thought. So congratulations, Mark. Other additional books of Mark's include Green Christianity, 5 Ways to a Sustainable Future, Finding God in the Singing River, Christianity, Spirit, and Nature. And one that has become very meaningful to me is his book called Fragments of the Spirit. He's also done a lot of, of course, the research for his books and his papers, and he has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Eugene M. Lang Foundation, the American Academy of Religion, and the National Endowment of the Humanities. But perhaps Mark's greatest achievement was actually putting up with me during interviews and communications for my dissertation. Mark is a mentor. His work has been very inspirational to me on my own spiritual journey, as well as Lori's. We consider Mark a kindred spirit, and have been blessed by Mark's presence in our life through him personally and through his research and writing. And I thank you so much, Mark, for willing to be here with us today and sharing. And may we all be open and blessed by what Mark will share with us.
I want to thank Lori for the exercise in mindfulness and contemplative, taking a moment to pause before we engage in the discursive work that we're about to engage in. I think we need both brains, the left brain and the right brain, to forge ahead in concert with one another to face the challenges that we face today. And doing work of a ritual nature in mindfulness and contemplation is critical for that. In fact, I think it's the baseline for everything else that we do. We can't go out unless we first go in. And I'm grateful, Lori, for that moment that we had at the start. And Brad, for your very generous introduction. I also feel a kinship with you and with Lori, the other Lori. And it feels like I've come full circle, having met you years ago and now being invited to participate in this discussion today. So thank you very much. I have a few minutes with you before we have some question and answer time and one or two other things that we will be doing this afternoon. I just want to double check that the audio is good. Everyone can hear me. Yeah, we're good with that. And that as I move into my comments now, I'll be using some technical terms. I'll try to speak clearly, but it might make sense if you have questions, even clarifying questions, to hold them until the end, either verbally or in the chat. But I'll try to be as clear as I can about the kinds of things that I'm trying to say. That's the first point I want to make, just as a propedeutic here. A couple of other points. One is that if in the context of my speaking, I say things that sound really odd to you, I'm trying to sound odd and unusual in some of what I say as a provocation and as an enticement to help all of us, myself included, think differently about Christian traditions in ways that might meet the challenges of our present time. So please stay with me, and as you have questions with what I say, if you find what I say troubling or unusual, please raise those questions. I really covet your pushback, your critique, your engagement. The other sort of preliminary comment is that I'm not an Indigenous person. And in the promotional material, I saw that I was identified as such, and I understand why, because in one of the earlier books that Brad mentioned, Finding God in the Singing River, I identified my great-grandmother as a Seminole woman, which would put me in a lineage of traditional peoples. But after much research and troubling self-discovery, both in terms of family narratives on the one hand and genetic testing on the other, I realized that that's probably not the case. And like maybe others of us on this call, there are stories that are often told about who we are that are compelling to the storytellers, but that sometimes may not be the case. And so I just want to clarify that point. I don't identify as an Indigenous person, and you'll see in my comments that I'm very much in conversation with Indigenous cultures and practitioners and exponents of a certain way of thinking that I'm going to talk about in a moment. But in terms of my own biological and family heritage, I don't see myself as a Native person or in any way genetically. Now I don't see myself as genetically related to Indigenous peoples. I want to talk with you about re-enchanting the world because my core belief is that without an attitude of re-enchantment, without the ability to see spiritual beings around us at all times, participating in this great web of life that makes up the miracle of life, without that ability to live in openness to the magic and the wonder and the beauty of the world, we won't save this beautiful biosphere for ourselves or for others. The comment that I think it was Lori made earlier, referencing one of my works, that the problem that is in front of us, I'm talking about the many problems that we face, chronic systemic racism, the collapse of the planet's life support systems, raging war, an active war in Europe, and problems that we are confronting, but in such a way that we seem unable to make any headway on. These problems, as I've written before, I think are matter of the heart, not the head. I don't think it's that we don't know what to do to address the systemic issues that confront us. I think it's that we're not motivated on the level of our deepest interior lives to want to make for the systemic changes that need to be made. And in that vein, what I want to suggest today is that if we could encounter the living world again as a magical, enchanted place populated with beings just like us, beings with sentience and awareness, a capacity for relationship, if we could encounter the living world with an attitude of beauty and wonder, then there's the potential that we might be able to preserve for ourselves and for others wonderful gifts that creation has brought to us. And so it's in that vein that I want to talk with you today about enchantment. And I want to talk about enchantment by doing a couple of quick studies of biblical passages that I think conjure for us this experience of the world as living place populated with myriad of life forms, all of whom have value and worth unto themselves. The first biblical passage I want to look at with you talks about birds, and the next one talks about trees. And the first passage I want to look at is in the Gospel of Luke. Now, this is a passage that runs through all four of the Gospels. It's also in Gospels, so-called extra-canonical Gospels that didn't make the final cut. But in all of the four Gospels of the New Testament, a story is told about Jesus's baptism. This may be familiar to you. What is often missed is the reference in this text to the Holy Spirit as a bird. And it's this passage I want to talk about. You may know this, that when Jesus was baptized, as he was coming up out of the Jordan River, the Spirit of God alighted upon him. And the Gospel of Luke, like the other Gospel writers said, and the Spirit appeared in bodily form as a dove. And then a voice from heaven was heard saying, "This is my Son, in whom I am well pleased." What's interesting about the passage, so the New Testament was written in Greek, is that in the Greek language, it's very clear what the author is driving at in this instance. The Spirit appeared in bodily form as a dove. And it's that phrase that I want to focus on for a moment. In Greek, that adverb, something appearing, something revealing itself in bodily form, is the word somatikos. It's from the Greek word soma, S-O-M-A. Now that word we don't have much in English. We do have it occasionally in medical jargon. So somebody is suffering from a psychosomatic condition, right? a condition that seems, its origin seems unclear, but perhaps the physical manifestation of that ailment is rooted in some psychological state of mind. So we call that psychosomatic. There's a relation there between the psyche and the body. That's the word soma in Greek. It means it has to do with anything having to do with the body. So going back to the Greek text in Luke 4, the Spirit appeared in bodily form as a dove. I said Luke 4, I meant Luke 3, Luke chapter 3. Appearing in bodily form means that literally the Spirit is showing itself in its bodily form as a dove. Now, for 2,000 years, Christian readers of that text have dismissed that text as a metaphor, a figure of speech, a rhetorical ornament that doesn't have any relevance to who God is in God's very nature, because we know, for example, that while God is invisible, immortal, all-wise, and then manifesting God's self in the person of Jesus. Now, again, I'm talking in terms of the varieties of Christianity. So we could talk about that in other religious traditions as well, but just sticking with biblical Christian traditions. But there has traditionally been the belief that the third member of what many Christians refer to as the Trinity, the unity of God manifesting God's self in three different forms, that manifestation of God's self in the third form, the Holy Spirit, is done in other ways. But God forbid that anybody would take seriously Luke's claim that the Spirit manifested itself as a bird. Be that as it may, the text says otherwise. The text says, as plain as the nose on my face, if one were to live in fidelity to the biblical witness and try as best one can to follow in the footsteps of its witness to reality as it understands itself, the biblical text says that God appeared in bodily form as a dove. It's not a metaphor. It's not a figurative expression of speech. It's a literal description of what God did at the time of Jesus's baptism, or to put it a different way, what God is, insofar as God manifested God's self in beak and in feathers, in bone and in claws, as a bird. So that's the first thing I want to say today, that God is a bird. Not looks like a bird, metaphorically can be spoken about in bird-like forms, takes on avian aspects when Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, later in the Gospel of Luke, how I would try to gather you to me like a mother hen does her brood. I think of that as a metaphor. I think Jesus is speaking about himself there as a mother hen in figurative metaphorical language, but not in this case. And so the first point I want to make is that, and let me ask Paul if you could show the first slide in this regard, is that God is a bird. And interestingly, the word there for bird in the Greek New Testament, the Greek word is parastera, but that word means alternately a dove or a pigeon. So I think of God maybe as a pigeon. I'm not trying to be slapdash or irreverent here. I'm trying to communicate what I think is something strange and wonderful, but that has largely been missed within the history of the Christian tradition. And largely it's been suppressed. It was difficult enough for Christians to imagine that God took on human form. But the overwhelming evidence, of course, throughout the New Testament is that God did exactly that. But the point also, and there are many instances of this, I'm just going to bring up one here today, is that God also took on animal form or non-human animal form, because humans are animals too. So God not only manifested God's self as human in Jesus, God also manifested God's self as avian in the spirit. In essence, the Christian religion is a religion of a double incarnation. God incarnated God's self in the person of Jesus. God infleshed, or if you would humor me a little bit, God infeathered God's self in the person of the Spirit. We can move away from the slide. And that in this first point I want to make opens up the possibility then of the Christian religion as a religion that understands divinity not only in human but in animal form. And insofar as the Christian religion then understands God understands God as manifesting or infleshing God's self in these two forms, then the scandal of the incarnation, the fleshiness of God, I think is widened in the core belief system that many of us embrace. And if you think about the notion of, to use this theological term, incarnation, this idea of God becoming carnate or carnal, C-A-R-N-A-L, is incredibly eye-opening, I think, as to who God is in the registry of the Christian witness. God is carnal. God is flesh. God is bone and beak and feathers and skin and all the vital bodily fluids that make up the human and the more than human world, so-called animate and inanimate. At its core, as insofar as Christianity is an incarnate religion, it's a religion about divine carnality. And we often, in our everyday speech, think of religious matters and carnal matters as binary opposites. There's heaven and there's earth. There's the great beyond and there's the here and now. There's the immaterial world and then the physical carnal world of our everyday mortal existence. I'm suggesting to you that that's the wrong way to think. That easy opposition between, as it were, the two worlds, the heavenly and the earthly, that too easy opposition that we operate with has blinded us to the core teaching of the Christian religion, namely that God is flesh, but not just human flesh, animal flesh as well, specifically in this case, birdie avian flesh. And that opens up then the possibility, so I want to use a technical term here. That opens up then the possibility that at its core, Christianity is an animist religion. So animist or animism, I'll spell it, is spelled A-N as in Nancy, I, M as in Mark, I-S-M as in Mark, animism. This is not a term that we use for the most part in everyday speech. The word animism in English, again, as a technical, theological or philosophical term, is a gloss on a Latin term, animus, A-N-I-M-U-S. Now, that also has another meaning in English, but at its root, the Latin term animus means spirit or soul. And so the belief, not the belief, the scholarship of 19th century British American early anthropology of religion was that first peoples or traditional or native peoples, what early scholars of religion called primitive people, that they were animists, A-N-I-M-I-S-T-S. They were people who believed that spirit or spirits inhabited all things. Every rock or tree or body of water had its guardian spirit or its spirit that it participated in, insofar as all things in this early anthropology of religion regarding first peoples, insofar as all things were in some sense a bearer of spirit or spirits. And so first peoples were referred to, but in a way that was degrading and dehumanizing and pejorative and racist. Indigenous peoples were seen by Western, white, Euro-American academics as primitive people who inhabited a world teeming with spirit or spirits. The world was always twofold for first peoples: physically manifested through human perception or understood through human perception, but also charged with spiritual presence. The belief among these early anthropologists was that over time, societies evolved in an evolutionary hierarchical way away from primitive belief in spirit to a world eventually where spirit, a place eventually where the world was evacuated of spirit or spirits. And the world then became, for Western people, not just through academic inquiry, but largely through commerce and other means over the last few hundred years, the world became a dead place, a place of objects, a place that collected things, most of which could be commodities for the growing economic marketplace that drove the engine of so-called civilization. Primitive people, uncivilized, were terrified of all of these spirits that inhabited rocks and trees and bodies of water, particular animals and so forth. We know, wink, wink, in our smug, sophisticated Western worldviews, that such a reality couldn't possibly be the case. And once we were able to evacuate the world of spiritual presence, it freed us, we, our ancestors, other people invested in this narrative, of most of whom had European origins, now in the Americas, other people who understood alongside us, our forebearers, our ancestors. I'm not saying all of you are this way, but many, if not most of us, came out of this way of thinking. That first peoples were childish and uncivilized, and then latter-day civilized people like our forebearers and our ancestors lived in a world that could be understood through metrics and mechanics and algorithms. Everything could be measured and quantified, calculated, monetized, because everything potentially is a commodity, not a bearer of spirit. So everything, right? Water, land, air, plants, animals. We refer to these beings as resources, natural resources that we can tap into, cultivate, and press into the service of our growing social and economic needs. What I'm suggesting to you And I'm doing this with reference to the Bible and strange readings of the Bible, like the one I just offered in regards to the bird divinity that appeared alongside Jesus at the time of Jesus's baptism. What I'm suggesting is that this worldview that we've inherited, which behind our backs, so to speak, informs everything that we do. What I'm suggesting is that this worldview is fundamentally wrong. It has no bearing on reality. It has tricked us into thinking that the great bounty of creation itself is a commodity or a thing, not a being with value and worth unto itself and all of its many inhabitants. And that Christianity, white, European, civilized Christianity, by destroying, by vanquishing, by denigrating the worldviews of First Peoples, lost its birthright, forgot its own genetic heritage, divorced itself from its true origins, when in fact, the Christian worldview I'm suggesting is largely continuous with the worldview not of late capitalist captains of industry. No, it's a worldview largely consistent with the worldview of First Peoples, both historically and in the present today. The worldview of most Indigenous peoples, which we can group under the rubric of Animism. I'm suggesting that Christianity, though it made war against animist peoples, is in fact a variation on animism. And at its beating heart, at the center of its own soul, is a worldview consistent with animist belief, which is that everything is alive, everything is sentient, everything is inspirited or ensouled. Everything has its own inherent value and worth. And everything has the capacity for relationship. So think about it this way, as one scholar of animist traditions named Graham Harvey has put it. All of us are persons, only we ourselves are human persons. But all things, all beings are bearers of personhood. There are the rock people and the tree people. There are the water people. There are the bird people. And traditional peoples, traditional human communities have understood the personhood, so to speak, of other beings. But that's something largely in the West, we arrogate to ourselves that title of being persons over and against all other beings, which lack personhood, and therefore they don't have the same value and worth that we do. So I know this is odd, and it's a different way to think, at least it is for many of us. But what I'm suggesting is that if you read the Christian tradition and the biblical text with green eyes, with animist eyes, so to speak, if you read Bible and tradition with green eyes, things are revealed that, for the most part, we wouldn't see otherwise. And one of the things we notice, and I'll mention something else here now, but one of the things we notice is that God appears in avian form in that early text regarding the baptism of Jesus. In that sense, God is a bird. not just a human individual in the person of Jesus, but an avian individual in the person now of the Spirit. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip the next slide, Paul, and let me go to the slide that is marked "Everything is Sacred." So I was going to talk about birds and trees. I'm going to skip the conversation about trees. Maybe we can get to that in the question and answer, but let's see if we can move to this one. And let me talk with you about this for a moment. Thank you, Paul. So from an animist perspective, if God manifested God's self in avian form, that signals to us that everything is sacred. Yes, we as human beings, we're all perhaps in our own terrible disguises sometimes, but we are all manifestations of divinity, but not just us, all other beings as well. Not just the human order, but the more than human order, now symbolized in the person of the Spirit. The more than human order also is charged with sacred value, is chock full of divinity. And if you think about that idea, that opens up all kinds of possibilities for a new way of living in the grace and in the gratitude of the Christian witness. Now with an eye towards the inherent sacredness or divinity of all things, I call that Christian animism, a way of understanding that the Christian tradition at its core is animist. And the way I think of this has been well expressed in my mind by a poet farmer from Kentucky named Wendell Berry, who said that there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. There are no places that are unsacred, that are removed from God, that are divorced from divinity. There are no places that are not inherently charged with divine spirit, with God's very presence. I think that's what the teaching about Jesus's baptism and the Spirit bird who alights upon Jesus at the time of his baptism embodies. But then Berry goes on to say that since there are no unsacred places, there are only sacred and or desecrated places. And that way of thinking then does recognize that we can desecrate, make unsacred, violate the fundamental divine character of the great gift of creation, if we're so inclined to do so. The problem is we can move away from that slide, Paul. The problem is that we've been so successful at blotting out God's presence through, in our minds, evacuating the world of God's Spirit, rendering everything, as I said earlier, as a commodity, a resource, a thing to be manipulated and controlled by us. We've been so successful at that we can't see God in our everyday lives and in the natural world around us. It's not that God is dead. It's that we have erased most, if not, and I think for many of us, all traces of divinity within our everyday lives. There was a Jewish philosopher and theologian by the name of Martin Buber in the last century who survived the death camps in Germany during the Second World War and was eventually able to immigrate to Jerusalem. And when he was asked, where was God in Auschwitz? How can a Jew, how can anybody believe in God after the monstrosity of the Shoah, the final solution. Buber said, it's not that God has abandoned us. It's that through the choices we've made, we've put God into eclipse. It's as if we have created a fake reality, a kind of intergalactic screen, so to speak, that hides, to use this image of God going into eclipse, that hides God from us, that effaces God, that erases God's presence and the traces of divine presence in our midst. And I'm sympathetic to what Buber said, but I want to underscore what's at stake if you make the move to Christian animism in a world that seems to be divorced from God's presence. And what happens in that context is that, okay, maybe it's that God has gone into eclipse. God is still there. We just can't see God because of the choices that we've made. That's Buber's point. But another way of thinking about the danger of Christian animism for our time is this. If you take seriously the claim that I'm suggesting, that God is in all things, everywhere, always and already, at all times, without division and without confusion, God is imminently bound up with everything that is. Again, not just in the human order of things, but in the more than human order of things. So the bird God of the gospel witness. If you make that move and you make war against God's, now we're talking about God as being part and parcel of everything that is. You make war against God's flesh, God's body, God's enfeathered, embodied, incarnated presence, then you run the risk of traumatizing, injuring, doing harm to, perhaps permanently, perhaps, I'm just suggesting this, I don't know, fatally. You run the risk of doing harm to God insofar as you do harm to God's body. If the earth is the body of God, infleshing God's self in our everyday reality, and we make the earth as we have done cruciform, if the crucifixion of Jesus 2,000 years ago signals to us something fundamental about what it means to be human, that we take God, put God onto a cross, torture that manifestation of God in the person and the body of Jesus. And that communicates to us then, in some sense, that's who we are. We kill God when God manifests God's self to us. We practice deicide, the death and the killing of God by what we did, not only insofar as we're implicated in those who crucified Jesus, but then insofar as we continue to do harm against God's presence in the everyday, then we've made the earth cruciform. The crucifixion isn't something that just happened 2,000 years ago in one place on a particular hill, Golgotha, the place of the skull, somewhere outside Jerusalem, up on a tree with Roman centurions and Jesus's family and the women who followed him, not his male disciples. No, it's that's who we are, and that's what we continue to do. Daily we crucify Christ afresh, insofar as the lash marks that we applied to Jesus 2,000 years ago now get spread out across the whole expanse of God's body, not just that one physical manifestation, the body of Jesus, but now the whole expanse of God's body, insofar as God has manifested God's self among us in the trees and in the bodies of water and in the plants and the animals and the landscapes and the atmosphere itself. All of that, insofar as it is God bodying insofar as it is God bodying God's self forth into the world, now bears the signs of the lash marks and the cut marks of human sin and the sin against creation that we continue to perpetrate. But not just, if you catch what I'm saying, a creation divorced from God in God's inner life, but a crucifying set of behaviors that extends the crucifixion of Jesus now across the whole planet. There was an article that I read recently in the Atlantic Monthly, and Paul, if you could flip to this image, the next image. And it was an image like this that accompanied the article. And the article was called, "When Global Warming Kills Your God." And it was about Indigenous people in the northern parts of the hemisphere, of the Western Hemisphere, who are struggling to find God in a world where global climate crisis is eradicating their traditional folk ways and economic practices and religious rituals. In a warming world, these fisher people are not able to do what they used to do as a sacred exercise in their interaction with the natural world. The joy of Christian animism is the possibility, and I'll stop with this. The joy of Christian animism is the possibility that we will find traces of divinity everywhere. When we use new glasses and we read the Bible in the Christian tradition with green eyes, new possibilities are revealed about God's presence in the everyday. But the risk with that new set of optics, as we think less in capitalist and more in animist terms about the world, the risk is that we now realize that we are doing, as we did 2,000 years ago at Calvary, that we are doing lasting, systemic, and perhaps irreparable harm to God in God's inner life. We can move away from that slide. That we're doing perhaps irreparable harm to God in God's inner life, insofar as we continue to perpetrate the trauma against the earth, against God's body, that we have participated in for 2 millennia. So the upside of Christian animism, the possibility of seeing all things as divine, and the downside to me is now the recognition of our complicity in bringing harm and trauma into the inner life of God because of the lifestyle choices that we've made. That's my vision of enchantment and possibility, and the dark side of that enchanting worldview that I wanted to offer up today in terms of Christian animism. And I appreciate your participation in what I've had to say, and hopefully now some time for discussion. But I think before we move to the discussion, I want to turn, I believe, to Lori first, and then we move into the discussion section of our time today.
Laura, you need to unmute yourself.
Yes. I just wanted to say with, I don't even know how to describe it. I just want to say thank you for what you have offered to us already. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion and working together to deepen the shakeup. I really love that you began with this recognition of provoking us out of our old habit patterns of thought, because these ideas are truly transformational. And so I wanted to share, I want to offer us a couple of minutes, a minute or so, again, of entering some quiet, but with 3 different questions. And I'm finding these questions very helpful, but I also cannot get at my screen to advance them. Let's see here. Yeah, that's, so I'm gonna have to stop again, because there we go. Thank you. I'm gonna get out my full screen, and I apologize. All right. All right, so can you see this thing that says 3 questions for nurturing transformation? And then now you're back. You know what I need to do? Hang on a second.
We see it, Laurie.
Okay. I now have my controls back under my mouse. So we have been engaging in the challenging work of working to change our hearts and our understandings, not anyone else's, our own. And so this kind of transformation that is needed for choosing a greener way of life, of finding that path of reading the Bible through those with those green eyes, disallows complacency. And so I want to offer 3 questions that I'm finding really helpful for me to tend the interior movements that rise when we're challenged in these transformative ways. So here's the question, and just I'm going to then give everyone a minute to sit with these questions and to formulate your questions that you would like to bring to our dialogue with Dr. Wallace. Where is there resonance in what you've heard? Notice where you're experiencing that pulse of recognition, that affirmation of some personal experience, something that gives you that shiver of excitement, or that deepens the longing that brings you to this quest. Second, where is there resistance? So pay attention also when your heart hesitates or stirs with questioning. I'm finding that when I tend that resistance, it keeps me from getting hooked by it. It invites me to re-examine my assumptions and sometimes steers us in new directions. And that brings me to the 3rd question: where is there realignment? So noticing and nurturing the interior movements, really listening in the silence for places that feel like a shift or an opening or a expansion or a harmonizing or a realignment. What is being reconfigured in you such that you might live out of a slightly or not so slightly different place going forward? So I commend these questions to you, and we'll take, just a moment, a minute maybe, to just stop and breathe and notice in yourself where there's resonance, where there's resistance, and where there are the stirrings of realignment.
All right, we're now going to enter into a time where there's opportunity for posing questions to Dr. Wallace and engaging in some conversation about what we've heard. And there have been a number of questions in the chat. And Lori, if you'll help me by keeping an eye on the screen and the panels for people who raise their hand as well. First of all, Dave Anderson, you asked the question, how does the discussion change if we move the center of the argument from the earth to the cosmos? Thoughts, Mark? And you got to take yourself off mute.
Unmute here.
Good.
So I really like that question, and I have struggled with that a lot. The biblical witness oscillates between focusing on the earth and then the particular concerns and needs of particular life forms, including human beings, and then it oscillates between that and larger cosmic, extraterrestrial, beyond the earth kinds of concerns. I want to speak to that question. I also want to speak to, I think it was a question, let me just look here quickly at the chat. It was a question that Lori suggested or asked about in relation to the notion of human exceptionalism, the idea that humans are of more value and worth than other beings, and therefore, in particular, are God's focus in the salvation story that many of us have adopted. I think if you read the biblical texts in their full arc, not just in relation to traditional church teachings, what you see is that the cosmos is the all-enveloping focus of God's compassion and concern, within which all of Earth's inhabitants are understood. And within that, human beings get some focus and concern. Whereas we have taken that cosmic, earth-based, and then human focus, we have taken that and flipped it on its head, and we act as if the biblical story is primarily a story about God's interaction with human beings and human salvation, and the earth and the wider cosmos are bit players in that story, irrelevant perhaps to that story, and in some cases in Christian traditions, inimical to the well-being of humans, as if humans became too close to other life forms on Earth or concerned about cosmic questions, that they would somehow lose their focus on what really matters, which is human salvation. That way of thinking, to me, is an exercise in religious human chauvinism, to put a point on it, human exceptionalism, but I call it human chauvinism. It's that we arrogate to ourselves some special way of, we arrogate to ourselves a special role in God's compassionate concern for all things that we think trumps everyone else's value and worth. So I'm speaking in such a way to say that I think the biblical witness is about God's cosmic compassion for all things, within which earth and humans are understood, rather than the other way around, the human chauvinist perspective, which puts the emphasis on human salvation history with reference to God and Christ and the Spirit in human lives. Let me pause there.
So let me pose the question I asked. If Earth survives the extinction of humans, then does God not remain, despite all the damage we've done to God through our destruction of the habitable aspects of Earth? And I guess I'd add a corollary to that. Thinking back to the death of God theologians and their notion that God is in fact a creation of the human mind. And I guess then to take that further, do we not have an interest in re-enchanting the world for our own survival's sake?
Well, that's interesting. Enchantment. I'm just writing this down so I don't forget that part of your question, Dean. Let me speak to the first issue, that if Earth, if it looks like perhaps that Earth could survive the extinction of humans, what happens to God despite all the damage that we've done? And this also dovetails with another question about, again, using some technical language here, something like pantheism, the belief that God and Earth are coterminous realities that are essentially the same thing, understood slightly differently, such that we could speak about reality in earthly terms or in divine terms, but we're speaking about the same thing. So I want to push back against both pantheism, also a variation on that came up in the question, panentheism, but we're going to get into some minutiae here. So let's just to keep it simple. I want to push against pantheism and push back against pantheism because I want to define Christian animism this way. Christian animism understands that God risks everything by enfleshing God's self in human and in more than human form. But what it means for God to risk everything, we don't know what that means. That's what I think the writer in the book of Colossians in the New Testament says when the writer says, Paul, perhaps, that in Christ, God evacuated God's self. God emptied God's self. The Greek word for that self-emptying is kenosis, K-E-N as in Nancy, O-S-I-S. That means to completely empty or evacuate oneself of one's self by becoming other in another, by becoming a self in another. And that's what God continuously does throughout the biblical story. God empties God's self. God splits God's self, divorces God's self from God's self, enters into the other. I'm going to get to this question of what happens to God. Does God remain if humans or the earth itself is extinguished? But let me just underscore what I think is emotionally involved here in this way of thinking. Think about what happens to God on the cross in the Christian story, at least according to two of the Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. You may remember that in those Gospels, when Jesus is about to expire and taking in his last breath, he cries out to his Father, my God, why have you forsaken me? So at the moment of what could be a kind of moment of triumph, of victory, the salvation of humankind has been accomplished by Christ bearing on his shoulders, so to speak, the sins of the world. It's not that in those two Gospels. It's a moment of a family rupture of profound implications as to what's happening in the inner life of God in God's self. Unless God is a stone with no heart and no capacity for feeling or emotion, then when Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Something rips apart in God and God's self. It's not just the temple curtain in that story in the old temple of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, the second temple, where the curtain rips, allowing a new form of religious life to take place. Something rips apart within God, in God's own inner life as well. Unless God is unfeeling. And forgive my comments about stones, because stones also feel. So unless God is a bot, right, some sort of artificial mechanical thing, then God feels in God's self the pathos, the trauma, the injury that God's Son feels. I'm suggesting that that's what happens to God when we wreak havoc across the planet, causing deep injury within God's own inner life. So does God remain if we extinguish the human, if we despoil and degrade the planet? I think Christian animism stands for let me use this term, a dialectic. It tries to say two things at one time. On the one hand, God has risked everything by becoming flesh. On the other hand, God is still God, and in God's inner life and in God's capacity for self-maintenance, God seeks to preserve God's self within the trauma and injury that we have brought into God's inner life, just like God sought to preserve God's self, even with the split God felt over the death of his Son and the cry of dereliction of his Son from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? But I say this in the registry of faith, not knowledge. If God emptied God's self of everything by becoming one with the earth, and we do trauma and harm to the earth, then we are doing harm and we are traumatizing God. Does God survive that trauma and that horror? I don't know. I don't think the Christian tradition tells us that. It gives to God God's prerogative to be God. But if God, in God's inner life, not by necessity, but by free choice, decides to become one of us in all aspects, as we do harm to ourselves and to others and to our planetary commons, we do harm to God, I think the verdict is out. If we do ecocide, I'm suggesting to you that we run the risk of deicide. I'm not a death of God theologian. I don't think God has died. I don't think God has withdrawn from us or absented God's self from who we are. But I do think we run the risk of deep and perhaps permanent and perhaps lethal trauma to God in God's self, insofar as we continue to lay waste to the great commons and the great bounty that's been given to us.
Mary Jacks, you had your hand up. Do you still want to ask your question? You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Celtic spirituality has a lot of these things that raises the dove is compared to a goose.
Mm-hmm.
What is your sense of how we're hearing so much about Celtic spirituality? It's becoming more prevalent. What resonates with you, with what you're saying, and about our native First Nations and so forth?
So, and I appreciate you mentioning First Nations as well. I think of Celtic spirituality both the spirituality of pre-Christianized peoples
Yeah.
and peoples who were beginning to embrace the Christian tradition and still preserving
Yeah.
aspects of their own fundamental animist worldview
Yeah.
is analogous to the First Nation conversation. For those of us who aren't members of tribal communities or who aren't Celtic Christians in the historical sense of pre-Christian peoples that were then converted to Christianity. Now, that might have been the case with some of our ancestors, but two of the most important dialogue partners for Christian animism are Indigenous peoples, both historically and in the present, on the one hand, and historical and present Celtic Christians on the other. There are many aspects of what I've said that resonate deeply in me with Celtic Christian belief. In Indigenous terms, the idea of divinity becoming one with particular animal forms like birds is something that I have used to illuminate what I think is one of the core teachings of Christianity. It's not that Christianity then becomes an indigenous religion.
Yeah.
It's that in dialogue with indigenes, it now realizes its own lost heritage. And I feel the same way about key beliefs among Celtic people. And let me just suggest one. Key beliefs that have recovered for me the pearls of great price that have been buried within the deep heritage of Christianity, but largely forgotten and suppressed. One of the ideas among Celts was the idea of what has been called thin places, thin,
Yeah.
Thin.
Yeah.
These are places that seem to speak metaphorically, that seem to bring together heaven and earth, that seem to operate in a vortex or on a plane or in a field where divinity and corporality are intimately related. Now, I'm suggesting from a Christian animist perspective, that's always the case. Divinity and materiality are always inseparably united. That's why God is at risk with us and why we are putting God at risk by continuing to wreak havoc in our planetary commons. But the idea of thin places is that, and this has meant everything to me in my Christian walk, is find in your everyday comings and goings places where God's presence hasn't gone into eclipse, hasn't been erased, hasn't been driven into obscurity because of human arrogance and greed. So I seek out natural places where I think I'm feeling and hearing and seeing God rustling and flying and moving about, and in the shadows and in the crevices and in the corners of this place becoming visible. Years ago with my wife Audrey, we hiked the El Camino de Santiago, which is an ancient Christian, now open to all people of goodwill, religious or not, but an ancient Christian pilgrimage route that cuts through most of Western Europe, but in particular the part of northern Spain, roughly.
Yeah.
And hiking the El Camino, making that a living case study for what it means to be human. We're always in motion. We're all pilgrims trying to get from one place to another, looking for traces of God in our midst. Audrey and I, so this is where the spiritual and the material come together. Audrey and I were hiking through a tunnel underneath a highway. So not a natural space, but a concrete viaduct in the midst of what it was an otherwise beautiful landscape in which we were being pilgrims. And in this viaduct, in this passageway, someone had graffitied on the wall in Spanish, Maria, you are my Camino now. And I and I just thought to myself, you know, that person had brought together the outer Camino, the walk, with the inner Camino of his heart. And he could see in that relationship with Maria, or she could see in her relationship with Maria, this connection between the spiritual path and being in love. So that was the Camino in that particular moment. That's a thin place for me. That's where divinity and earthly life crash together, come into contact. And there were exciting moments and sparks and even some pyrotechnics for me with my wife that were triggered by that graffiti. And I just mentioned that as a way of making sense of the ancient Celtic Christian notion of thin places, so that for all of us, this is my hortative appeal to each of you on this call. Seek out in your life thin places where you can find God in the natural world.
So we have 5 minutes left of our scheduled time, and I think that's allocated to some final remarks and information. I also note there are a lot of comments as well as questions in the chat. And Rod, I'm wondering if we can preserve the chat and perhaps in some way publish it on our website, because I think there are a great many insights and questions for further reflection that are very worthwhile. I do want to ask you to come back to my question about whether the survival of the human species depends upon their re-enchantment of the world in order to, among other things, avert the climate catastrophes in front of us.
Yeah, I just very quickly, not only, let me just put this as clearly as I can, it's a necessary and sufficient condition for us. I actually think it will be sufficient, but it's definitely necessary for us to reimagine the world as sacred place if there is any hope of preserving in this generation and in future generations the integrity of the human species. Look at it this way. There's an ancient Native American proverb that says the frog does not destroy the pond in which it lives. So who are we? Not only are we not at the top of the evolutionary order, which many theologians and others say, we're dumber than toads. We don't have the intelligence of a frog. We can't even figure out how basic and fundamental it is to preserve the life support systems, the great pond, so to speak, that makes up our existence. We are doing everything we can. Big gas, big oil, big coal, just to name those three horsemen of the apocalypse. We are doing everything we can through just fossil fuel abuse. That's our true religion. But we're doing everything we can to undermine the integrity of our planet's life support systems. So the only way we will be able not to do that is to fall in love with our planetary commons again, like our ancestors did, and like many indigenous people and people who practice Celtic Christianity have continued to do. I mean that, I really mean that. I mean, it's like, it's not a head scientific or policy-driven thing. It's finding a way to fall in love again with our biotic and abiotic brothers and sisters. And I believe Jesus did this in his everyday commerce with trees and with flowers and with animals and people too, human people. But we have lost this. And for the most part, Jesus doesn't come to us anymore as an animist. He comes to us as a kind of preacher about human salvation. But what I'm suggesting is that indeed, Dean, in relation to your question, without a spiritual orientation to the bounty of creation, coming again into an emotional, heartfelt relationship of care and compassion with others, human and more than human, then no, our prospects are grotesquely bleak.
Thank you, Mark. Brad, is it you or who's there?
Yes. So yeah, I am extremely grateful for what you have presented and shared with us today, Mark. You've lifted and made us think and lifted up questions within us. And I continue to encourage people to continue to delve into those questions and to share them and wonder about them. And if you want to learn more about Mark's work and thoughts and about Christian animism or falling in love with the world again, I recommend these books by Mark. Some of them I would say, like, for example, Growing Christianity is kind of a how-to, certain things about helping, steps and choices to make. And the rest have both the elegance of theology with Mark's personal testimony. And so I highly recommend those as well. And I know that we can move up. Next slide. No, not yet. Our next, go ahead and take that slide down. Yeah, that's fine. So in our next March webinar, I just want to make sure everybody is aware that David Anderson will be our presenter and looking at climate impacts on global security. And we hope you'll all be able to join us next month, Sunday, March 26th. And one last thing I'd like to share is that from a personal point, that yes, Mark has in his theology and his work, and he has helped me in my spiritual journey along the way, and also looking at those pieces within the Community of Christ tradition that have become very important to me. And so one of those is Doctrine and Covenants, section 90, and the verse of that spirit and element are inseparable. And that comes to our tradition at the beginning of the church in the 1830s. And to me, that simple statement has such a powerful, a very poignant inspiration for my own work. And I think for the work of the church of upholding the sacredness of creation. And I just want to thank you, Mark, for your sharing. And I want to thank everybody who participated in your wonderful questions. And I'm sorry we were not able to get to everybody and everybody's questions. But yes, we will try to preserve those and again, talk to other people as well about these questions. And I know, and because I have the mic at the end, I know that I'm going to give my wife just a second to share something.
So in around 2006, 2007, having been through the crucible of trying to survive Lyme disease and coming through a very dark place, and also having a long relationship with meeting God in nature. I found myself living in one of those thin places in the wilderness of the North Georgia mountains. And over the course of a year, found great healing in experiencing God in birds, to the point where I developed a very personal relationship with God in birds specifically. I had no theological context for that at the time. All I knew is that was part of who I was, and that the woods are one of my favorite congregations. Fast forward a few years, when I was the research assistant for my dear love, struggling to work on his doctorate, and sitting down with Mark Wallace in his office, and suddenly out of Mark's mouth comes something along the lines, if God could incarnate God's self through the life and body of witness of Jesus Christ, then God can also choose to infeather God's self in the witness and body of a bird. And it just quickened in me that experience of the healing spirit of God through birds. And Mark gave me a theological context in which to explore that side of my own spirituality. And so I just wanted to say thank you for your work and for your heart and for being a mentor for Brad and I in our efforts to let these important messages be heard throughout our faith tradition. So thank you, and thank you for your presence and for who you are and your courage.
Thank you, everybody. Again, please join us next month for our next webinar series. Have a good evening or morning or wherever you live.